addiction now comes with its own e-version. So what concerns you most about people turning to e-cigarettes?
Well, what concerns me most is the push in some camps to rush into having them available to everyone before they've been properly assessed, and the concern that if and when they do come on the market, they won't be properly regulated to ensure that some legitimate concerns about their use are addressed. I wouldn't say I'm an opponent of e-cigarettes, but I'm a proponent of regulating them the same way we regulate every other drug and drug delivery device, which e-cigarettes unquestionably are.
Amy, what's the general state in the U.S.? I know it varies state to state, but what is the general regulations there?
Well, it does vary state to state. In the U.S. in 2010, the FDA attempted to regulate e-cigarettes in the same way that Canada did, and they failed. They chose, rather than to appeal the court decision and continue to try to press to regulate them as drug delivery devices, they're apparently going to shift their strategy to regulate them as tobacco products. And at that level, the debate is really whether they should be regulated as reduced risk tobacco products, or whether they need some different kind of regulatory category altogether in order to prevent the very small e-cigarette manufacturers from being pushed out of the market, and for the big tobacco companies to be the only ones positioned to be able to manufacture and control the sale and production of e-cigarettes.
Is there a certain age restriction as to who can buy them now currently?
No, there's not. I mean, that's done on a state-by-state basis. Some states have restricted the sale to minors, and that's something I certainly agree with. Some states have restricted, like New York City has restricted now the use of e-cigarettes in public settings. But those measures failed in Chicago. So it's going to be a sort of a mixed picture of what happens in the United States in terms of who can use them and where they're allowed to be used.
Matthew, sorry, Amy, I read a stat, and I don't know I think it's an American stat, but I'm not sure. But Matthew had said among kids in grades 6 to 12, the percentage using e-cigarettes has doubled from 2011 to 2012. Does that sound about right to you?
That's about right. That's statistics from the U.S. Center for Disease Control late last year, and so those trends are being seen in Canada as well, and they're concerning. They're concerning in particular because it shows that the companies manufacturing e-cigarettes are getting through to kids, and the nature of their products are designed in a way that would appeal to kids. They have fruit flavors, and the image that's being promoted along with them, the way they're being promoted through social media, appeals to a young demographic. This is exactly out of the tobacco industry's playbook, using tactics they used decades ago that they're no longer allowed to be doing. We are seeing them being used with this new product now to appeal to a youth market. And I think what virtually all public health people and health personnel and scientists agree on is that if these devices have a legitimate role, their role is to help smokers quit smoking for harm reduction. They have no role in the hands of children who have never smoked before.
What's your take on that, Amy?
Well, I would say certainly there's reason to be wary, and I think anytime you're talking about tobacco control and tobacco products, we need to approach everything with a great deal of skepticism. But one of the remarkable things about the CDC data on e-cigarette use is, first, it's important to understand that 9 out of 10 of the users, the teenage users of e-cigarettes, were already smoking. So they're attracting the percentage of new users they're attracting is very small. One of the things that the CDC didn't report until 2 months after they released these data was that smoking amongst teens declined during the same period of time. Now, this certainly does not mean that e-cigarettes are responsible for that decline in smoking, but it certainly does not mean that we can treat this as a warning sign that e-cigarettes are pushing teenagers in the wrong direction. It's a place where we need to now look very carefully to really understand what's happening.
Amy, you take issue with the treatment of smokers and the fact that many public health officials have taken an abstinence-only approach to reduce smoking. Do you think smokers have been unfairly stigmatized within our culture?
Well, I think that's a really good question, and I think one of the real challenges for people who work in the ethics of public health is to think about what the role of stigma is and whether it's legitimate to use. And certainly the denormalization of smoking has been central to the tobacco control strategy in the United States. And what's really interesting about the e-cigarette ads, so you played that ad, that blue ad, and Stephen Dorff at the beginning, if you begin to look at those, they're really they're really pinned on the stigmatization of smoking themselves. I don't want to smell like an ashtray.
Mm-hmm.
This is no aphrodisiac. It implies that you're harming people around you when you smoke. So it's not as though e-cigarettes are undermining that stigmatization message, and they may be they could have the potential to be a powerful public health ally.
Matthew, how do you respond to that?
I must say I agree with the point Amy made about stigmatization. The intent should not be, the deliberate intent should not be to stigmatize people who smoke. They suffer from a chronic disease called addiction, and they are like other people who are addicted to other substances in our society. We do stigmatize them unfairly. We make them victims of a disease that they have. Now, that has to some degree helped smokers quit, but that wasn't the intention of the regulations. The intention of the regulations is to control the behavior, to make it inconvenient, to encourage smokers, the overwhelming majority of whom want to quit, to succeed in doing that. Marketing, whether it can serve the public good to have marketing of e-cigarettes deliver this message depends. That same ad you showed off the top also, though, contains the same misleading information about freedom, as though it's giving you your freedom back to use this. This is the same misleading tactic that the tobacco industry used when it hooked the population on cigarettes. When you're talking about an addictive substance, it's never about your freedom. It's about the company taking your freedom away by addicting you to their product and eliminating your freedom to get away from that consumption without bad consequences to you.
There's another brand out there called Enjoy, N-Joy, and they come the closest, I thought, to making a health claim. They say their tagline is, "Friends don't let friends smoke." What's your take on that, Amy?
Oh, I absolutely agree with it. There's granted, the evidence is at a nascent stage. There's not a great deal, but the evidence that's available is pointed in the direction that the people who are using these products are current smokers, that they are trying to use them as cessation devices. They're probably at least as effective as nicotine replacement therapy. Some studies have indicated they're no more effective. Others have indicated they're more effective. But there's no question. But certainly they have less carcinogens in them. The amount of nicotine can be controlled in a different way. So there's no question that sort of on an individual basis that these are safer products. And Dr. Stanbrook's concern, and it's a legitimate concern, is that it's not so much the individual user, it's the use patterns that are going to result in the population. And are they going to serve as gateways to more smoking, or are they going to serve as gateways out of smoking? That's
exactly the issue. I noticed that in the marketing, nobody's really marketing their e-cigarettes as a smoking cessation device. Is that because they don't want to, Matthew, or is it because the FDA and Health Canada won't let them?
They're being careful not to, at least through traditional media sources. You go on social media, it's a different story. Recent studies showed that on Twitter, about 10% of the tweets about e-cigarettes are making health claims about smoking cessation, and the vast majority of those are coming from e-cigarette companies. So in a sense, they're violating the law on Twitter, which sort of crosses boundaries. But in traditional media, they're being very careful not to, because the second they do, they immediately fall under the FDA's drug regulations. Here, Health Canada has said no matter what you call it, they are drugs, and they absolutely have the authority to do that. So they can't get away from it anyway they look at it. But in the U.S., it's a little bit different because of their different laws. I would add to what Amy said before, it's not just the societal effects or the behavioral effects that I have concerns about. There is a safety use in the devices themselves. Now, clearly the devices are not going to be as risky as a cigarette on a one-on-one basis, but they shouldn't be risky at all. These are manufactured
They're not
products.
risk-free, you're saying?
They're not risk-free. It's not just that. You don't know what you're buying. If you're a user out there and you're listening to this marketing, you're being told that this is safe. There's nothing in this but the nicotine, and that's all you're getting. That isn't true. There are virtually no regulatory controls on the standards of this. The nicotine that's in here is not necessarily pharmaceutical-grade nicotine. Often it's low-grade nicotine that has a lot of contaminants in it. Tests the FDA did a few years ago found many carcinogens in some e-cigarette products, some at similar levels to those in tobacco. There is absolutely no excuse for that. These are being manufactured. They should and could be manufactured in a way that delivers no toxins, delivers things safely, and the only way to enforce that is to ensure that they are held to the regulatory standards of drug products and drug device products. which is what Canada has done, but the U.S. unfortunately has not been able to do.
Amy, do you think people should be allowed to smoke e-cigarettes wherever they like?
Based on the scientific evidence, I would say at this point, yes, but it goes beyond a question of just evidence. Do you want, I think it's a tough question. Do you want to see restaurants again filled with vapor?
Airplanes, hospitals?
But I think that's a question that's more a cultural question. It's more a social norms question. It's not a question of science and evidence. And so I think we have to answer those questions with a different kind of lens entirely.
So tell me if I'm correct on this, Amy, your basic stance, if the 30,000-foot view of your stance is if it saves lives, if it's safer than cigarettes, it's a good thing. Matthew, you're saying that doesn't count for you, that if you bring back the behavior of smoking into the culture again, we lose the big battle and not just the skirmish. Am I right?
Well, I think you can have it both ways. I mean, we could allow a safe, proven e-cigarette with proven efficacy onto the market without opening up the places where you could smoke. There's no reason we couldn't restrict use of e-cigarettes to places where you're currently allowed to smoke. Let's remember, I think most of us agree that the only legitimate use of these products is for smoking cessation. I'll disagree with Amy on this point. We have over a century of experience with tobacco and what that did to society and the unintended consequences of that. Have we learned nothing from that we should apply now to regulating this new device that delivers the same addictive substance? There's something deeply wrong with allowing the marketing of an addictive drug to people who haven't used it before for purely recreational purposes. I don't see why society has any interest in allowing that, especially when it's deliberately gearing itself towards vulnerable youth. I don't agree that we should allow recreational use of this addictive drug, and I think it should be kept for its only reasonable purpose, which is to help smokers quit, which has yet to be proven to be effective in saving lives. I think it could. I think we need to wait for that evidence.
How long does that evidence usually take to come out in the world? Does it take a decade?
It should take less than that. I mean, from start to finish, yes. We've had a couple of clinical trials already. The best form of evidence are randomized trials. We've had two. They've been rather disappointing. Amy alluded to them before. I mean, the most recent of them showed that they were about similar to a nicotine patch. Some say, well, that's evidence that they work. But on the other hand, we already have nicotine patches and several other forms of nicotine replacements and a couple of prescription drugs that are effective in helping smokers to quit. Where is the urgency for rushing these products on the market, given all the tools we have, without waiting for proper regulation until they're proven to be a more effective strategy, which I think they could be? I don't think we should skip the steps that we apply to every other drug and device to ensure that the public is appropriately protected before the product is left on the market. Let's go through the proper steps. Let's force the companies to design a safe and effective product, which they will do if governments make them do it.
Amy, do you agree with that? Are you on board with that?
No, I don't agree with that. And I think, if we didn't have the smoking epidemic that we have to remember that 19% of Americans still smoke. I'm not sure what percentage of Canadians.
Did you say 19?
19% of Americans still smoke.
It's about that here, isn't it?
And it's higher in other countries. So if you didn't have this problem, you were introducing a recreational nicotine device in a world in which you didn't have addiction at these levels. And you have to remember that tobacco is probably the greatest man-made killer of all time, and that's one of the reasons I would really want to stress that I am entirely anti-tobacco. I would like to see e-cigarettes be used as a strategy, a step along the way to complete tobacco prohibition. But I think you have to bear in mind, you have to look at the context in which they're being placed. And I think you have to also consider, public health, sort of very long resistance despite the evidence. You asked the question, how long does it take evidence to convince us? This evidence is going to be contested 5 years from now, 10 years from now. We have decades and decades of evidence that smokeless tobacco would be a far greater alternative to smoking, but public health has kind of taken on this sort of neo-temperance stand and posture, and it's never been open to, for the most part, it's never been open to harm reduction alternatives. And I think we have to consider that and ask sort of why we have taken such a hard stance, and we need to reconsider our reaction to harm reduction and our acceptance of it, particularly in the face of a product that is already out there in the marketplace and that's got an important social movement behind it. And I'm not moved at all by the arguments about freedom. I'm generally a public health paternalist, but I think this is a different case in which you're sort of talking about a tremendous harm that's already out there in the open.
Well, I want to thank you both today. It's a very, very interesting discussion. Dr. Matthew Stanbrook is the Deputy Editor of the Canadian Medical Association Journal, and he's been with me here in Studio Q. And Amy Fairchild is a Professor of Socio-Medical Sciences with the Center for the History and Ethics of Public Health at Columbia University. She was in our studio in New York today. Email us anytime at q@cbc.ca. I'm Terry O'Reilly. I'll be back after the break.
You are listening to Q with Jian Gameshi on 93.9 FM WNYC. Let us know what you think of the program. Go to wnyc.org/Q. Supposed to comment.
How cold is it, Mayor de Blasio?
It is deceptively cold.
Landlords, homeless people, anyone with water pipes, beware.
People, I think, sometimes think it doesn't feel so bad, but if you stay out there too long, it will feel bad and it will be dangerous, particularly to folks who are vulnerable.
On the next Brian Lehrer Show, the science and politics of below zero wind chills. The Brian Lehrer Show, weekdays at 10 a.m. on WNYC.
WNYC receives support from the NYU Stern Langone MBA for Working Professionals, ranked as one of the top part-time programs by U.S. News & World Report, offering evening and weekend classes in Manhattan. More information at langone.stern.nyu.edu.
Welcome back to Q on CBC Radio 1, Sirius XM, and from PRI Public Radio International. I'm Terry O'Reilly in for Jian Gameshi. Last hour, we had a Q debate on the pros and cons of vaping using e-cigarettes. And on the blog, you can weigh in. Is vaping a red herring on the road to a smoke-free existence, or are concerns about the liquid-filled cartridges overblown? And you can cast a vote on our poll if you like. And coming up, Jian in conversation with New Jersey judge turned stand-up comic Vince August. But first...